Hi everyone, I'm Tracie Goodman. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resource Agent for McCreary County Cooperative Extension, and this is the third installation of the Gardening Basics program series. Today we're going to talk about what to do when you plant your garden, so planting, care, and maintenance. So some of the general considerations that you need for planting is that your soil should be moist at planting time but not overly wet. So you want it to be crumbly but not stick together. And you want to drop your vegetable seed into shallow half-inch furrows for fine seed and deeper 1-inch furrows for larger seed. And plant seed more thickly than needed in case some do not germinate. So your germination rate isn't going to necessarily be 100% for every packet of seeds that you buy. There's really no way to tell. So if you plant 3 to 4 seeds in one spot, you're more guaranteed to get a sprout from that. And just cover your seeds and firm the soil very lightly over them. After germination, you'll need to thin the seedlings to correct their spacing. So this is if you plant your seeds more thickly. Once they come up and you have maybe 3 to 4 together, you'll pull up the weakest ones or pinch off the tops and leave the rest of them so that your plants are spaced correctly. Now, when you're buying seeds, you want to buy fresh, high-quality seed. I would recommend that you buy your seed on a yearly basis. So only buy the seeds that you're going to plant for that growing season. And using seed from previous year's plants, there is a way that you can do this properly and save your seeds, but it's generally not recommended, particularly for beginning gardeners, because that seed that you save may not germinate correctly, and if it cross-pollinates with other varieties, it may not breed true. Now, if you're purchasing transplants which are seeded at the right time and grown at the right temperature in abundant light and adequate moisture, are going to be compact with the distance between leaves very small. Your stems are going to be pencil thick and rigid, and your leaves will be dark green, large and upright with no tendency to droop. So the pictures on the left are some transplants that I actually just bought a couple of days ago. You can see the one on the top, the pepper plant. The leaves are really dense and dark green. They're upright. They're not drooping. And the plant on the bottom is a tomato plant. The stem is nice and thick. The leaves are close together and it's sitting upright. And it's also not too leggy, which you also don't want. Transplants that are trying to produce flowers or fruit are not really as desirable, as they are slow to develop good root systems to support later fruit production. So it kind of goes against your instinct a little bit to, when you see transplants that are out and they're fruiting or they're already flowering, you're like, well, that must be a good plant because it's producing fruit. But honestly, the opposite is true. You don't want it to start flowering or fruiting before you put them in the ground. Now, bare root transplants will be slower to establish than transplants that are grown in containers or in cell packs. When you plant bare root plants, they can undergo transplant shock, delayed fruiting, and also it encourages the spread of disease. When you purchase transplants, you're going to want to ask whether they have been hardened off. So the process of hardening off is to set them outside and acclimate them before you plant them in the ground. So if your plants haven't been hardened off, you want to place them in a cool spot and reduce the water for a couple of days, because when they're in that greenhouse, they're getting watered constantly. They're in ideal temperatures. And when you set them outside for a couple of days, they're going to acclimate to being outside, being out of that controlled environment, and they're more likely to be hardy plants after you put them in your garden. When you move your transplants to the garden, there are some steps that you can take to ensure that they grow properly after you plant them. So you want to transplant on a shady day in late afternoon or early evening so that this prevents wilting of plants. You want to soak your roots thoroughly an hour or two before setting them in the garden. Handle your plants really carefully also. If they're in those cell packs, maybe squeeze the bottom of it a little bit and loosen up that root system so that you're going to avoid disturbing the roots, and then kind of tip it upside down and make sure it comes out in a compact way. you want to dig a hole large enough to hold your roots. So set the plants to the lowest leaf at recommended spacings and press your soil firmly around the roots. So one example that I can think of for this is tomatoes. So typically you think, well, if I cover the root ball, that's enough, right? Tomatoes have these little fibers on their stems that help them to form a strong root system. So if you plant it up to that last leaf deeper, it's going to develop a much stronger plant and help it to be a hardier plant. Now this is optional. You can pour a cup of starter solution for root development in the hole around the plant. You can purchase starter solution at a garden supply store. After planting, you want to leave a slight depression for water to collect. So what I typically do is kind of create a little moat type around my plant. So I mound it and then create kind of a little moat so that my water can go to the root system. You want to shade the plants for a few days after transplanting. If it's on a very hot day, you can put newspapers or cardboard on their south sides just to kind of protect it from getting so much sun. And water the plants once or twice during the next week just to make sure that they're getting adequate water to be able to develop properly. Intensive gardening is a way that you can grow more food in less space. So if you don't have a very big gardening area, there are plenty of techniques that you can utilize to complement your space. Wide row planting is a good strategy. You can plant vegetables in very wide rows between narrow pathways as opposed to your classic single row style, which takes up a lot of space and it doesn't really utilize it in the best way. By wide row planting, you might reduce weed problems, although hand weeding is going to be more difficult because your plants are a little closer together. By doing wide row planting, less soil remains bare than in conventional gardens. So usually less erosion is going to occur there if you're planting on like a slight slope or a hillside. So you want to be aware though that there are vegetables that are prone to certain diseases which should not be planted too intensively. Now, one example for this is tomatoes. Tomatoes like a little bit of airflow between their leaves so that they don't hold too much moisture, and their bottom leaves tend to capture a little bit of disease if they get too wet. So when you place your plants too closely together, plant leaves retain moisture longer and disease organisms thrive and are more easily spread from plant to plant. So you want to refer to your seed packet as to how close you should really plant each thing that you're trying to grow. Now, another technique that is really, really popular is raised beds, which we've talked about before. Raised beds increase production by conditioning the soil for excellent root development. So you can really easily condition soil in a small space and make it a really great environment to grow your plants. When you combine raised beds with other intensive practices, that's even better. So you can do wide row planting in your raised beds, intercropping or succession planting, which we'll talk about in a second, and this gives your greatest yields in your garden if you combine methods together. So intercropping involves planting different vegetables side by side to take advantage of different times of maturity, of heights, spreads, and then your root development. So a classic example is corn and beans. A few weeks after you sow your corn, you can plant pole beans close to the corn rows, and then those beans are going to climb the stalks and use them for support. I've seen this a lot and it works really, really well. So succession planting is something that is really efficient and a good use of your garden space. This is when another seed or transplant immediately takes the place of a harvested plant. So an example of this is maybe after harvesting an early crop of sweet corn, you might follow that with your fall crop of broccoli, spinach, or snow peas. Vertical training is something that I'm a huge fan of, and I employ it every year with my garden. It involves growing plants upright rather than horizontally. So you can vertically grow vine crops, tomatoes, peas, and beans on wood, wire, or string trellises or in cages. So personally, what I do is I put a row of fence in the middle of my garden and I grow my tomatoes on both sides of that. And So as my tomatoes get taller, I can kind of stake them to that fence or tie them to the fence, and it makes it so much easier to manage the weeds around them, to pick your fruit, and make sure that it's disease free. So when you plant this way, besides having more plants per square foot, you're also going to have cleaner fruit that'll be a lot easier to harvest. Beans are also really great to grow this way. Cucumbers, anything that vines like that is going to be so much easier to harvest your fruit from. Care during the season. One of the most important things that you can do is irrigate your garden. So vegetable crops need about an inch of water per week. Rainwater, irrigation water, or both from April through September. Soils often will crust without adequate water, and this heavily slows your germination of crops. So when you plant your seed out, you definitely want to make sure that your moisture content in your garden is good so that your soils aren't too hard for those seeds to push up through. If you use overhead irrigation, you want to irrigate during the day so that all of the water is evaporated from the foliage before dark. So this is after you put your transplants in. You're going to want to make sure that that water is not on the foliage before dark because it reduces disease problems. As you can see in the figure, to encourage deep rooting after you transplant, you want to thoroughly water the upper 6 to 8 inches of soil. If you shallow water, it promotes shallow development of roots, which results in poor growth and increased risk of injury under severe weather conditions. So you really want to develop a very strong root system in your plants to make them grow better and make them much more hardy plants. And obviously there are several options for irrigation. You can use a standard garden hose with overhead spray, which is personally what I do. You can use a soaker hose, a trickle system, or a lawn sprinkler, and there are many instructions on how to do this and the different ways to do this in the publication listed at the end. Mulching is also a technique that I employ, and it helps so much. There are many attributes to mulching, but one of its greatest is that it helps control weeds. Mulch also helps to conserve your soil moisture by 50% or more because it covers the soil to slow down on evaporation. And most of the water conserved will reduce and/or delay your plant water stress. It also reduces erosion by breaking the impact of rain and water. And your nutrients are not going to leach as quickly under plastic and some paper mulches because less of your rainwater penetrates through it. Vegetables are going to remain a lot cleaner in mulch soils because they have less contact with the soil. So if you've seen water splash down on the ground and then splash back up on your plants, it covers the bottom leaves of your plants and gets them muddy and wet and makes them a lot more susceptible to diseases. So when it rains onto mulch, it kind of cushions that impact a little bit and it doesn't splash up as easily, which is great. Mulch also regulates the temperature of the soil, and there are so many options. You can do plastic or rubber mulching or organic mulch, which is straw, wood shavings. I have a couple of pictures on the left of leaves. Everyone has leaves. That's a great mulching alternative. And the standard wood mulch, you can really use anything to mulch your garden. However, you really don't want to use hay or straw that has any type of seeds in it because that is really going to promote weed growth, which you don't want. Disease control is very important during the growing season. So these are ways that you can mitigate these disease control before you plant, at planting time, and after planting. So before planting, you want to select a site, obviously, that is sunny and well drained. You're going to want to remove or deep plow under old crop debris well before planting. So get all that old stuff out of there. And if possible, you want to select disease-resistant varieties and disease-free transplants. That'll greatly improve your harvest. And importantly, practice crop rotation. This can be done in small gardens. It's a little harder, but you are going to have to keep records of how to rotate things. So I personally do this with my garden. I try to rotate as much as possible. And you want to avoid areas with poor air movement. We've already talked about this. Some plants do not like to be planted too closely together. At planting time, again, You want to consider seed that is commercially treated with fungicides. This helps a lot with disease prevention. You want to plant your seed into warm soils and space your plants again to assure air movement. Use proper fertility, so fertilize properly. Use raised beds. That is an option that you have to improve your drainage. And avoid overlapping your plantings to prevent disease moving from the old crop to the new one. So this is crop rotation. Now during the growing season, you want to regularly inspect your plants for disease. Stay on top of this, trust me. You want to remove parts of the plant or remove entire plants that are infected with disease. And also do not place them in your compost pile. Control weeds, that's a big thing to mitigate disease. Weeds harbor insects and disease organisms in and near the garden. You want to control insects also, which feed on vegetable plants or vector disease organisms. Water and mulch to avoid unnecessary plant stress. So when your plants are stressed, they're much more susceptible for disease. So this is really important to do. This is why weeding, this is why watering is so important. You also want to avoid wetting the foliage. So again, irrigate early in the day so that your foliage can dry out before dark. And use labeled fungicides only when they are needed. So I strongly suggest using these other methods first before you apply a fungicide. You also want to avoid working in the garden when the leaves are wet to reduce the spread of bacterial blights, and space your plants appropriately to encourage air movement. So a lot of this is repeat information, but it's repeated because it's important. Pest control is another biggie. So to control pests, these are a few ways that you can do it. Use recommended planting dates to produce plants that can be more tolerant of pests. Do not over-fertilize, as this may make them more susceptible to aphids. Aphids are the little creature in the bottom left corner. You want to control weeds in your garden because they harbor many types of pests and pathogens. If you only see a few, it's preferable to just handpick them and toss them in soapy water to get rid of them. Also, consider using row covers over seedlings or smaller transplants. And this last one, use insecticides only when it's needed. So if all of these other methods have failed you, you can use insecticides. It's okay. But if you use them, you have to read, understand, and follow all of the label directions with your insecticides, or this could severely hurt your plants. You also want to avoid spraying any plants or weeds that are in bloom in ways that are going to harm pollinators, because a benefit of gardening is that it attracts pollinators, and you don't want to kill those out. You only want to kill out harmful insects. Weed control. We all know this is super hard. It's very hard to stay on top of, but it has to be done. You want to prevent garden weeds from going to seed. Some seed can remain viable for 20 years or more. That's a really long time. You don't want to put up with this for that long. You should keep your border areas around the garden free of weeds. Also, clean your equipment after you're done. So your trowel, your hoe, whatever you have, to prevent weed seeds or plant parts from being transported into clean areas. Do not mulch with hay containing grass or weed seeds. I said this a few seconds ago. This is going to promote growth of weeds, which you don't want. Also, avoid using manure unless it has been sterilized or well composted, because that also contains weed seeds. Avoid using soil infested with weeds or weed seeds. So you want to use sterile soil if possible. I know that's not always possible, but if possible, that's your best bet. Avoid buying transplants that are weedy. So if you see weeds in transplants, that's a no. Purchase high quality vegetable seeds free of weed seeds. So when your soil and growing conditions are as ideal as possible, and your plants that are selected are adapted to the soil condition, your garden plants may have a competitive advantage over weeds. So there is no better way of controlling garden weeds than having vigorous, desirable plants to crowd them out. You want to give your transplants a head start and a good competitive advantage. There are several options of weed control. Obviously, we have probably all done weed control by hand. It's not the most fun, but it is effective. You can mulch, which I'm a huge fan of. It significantly reduces weeds. You still have to hand weed just a little bit, but it's definitely not as bad if you mulch around your plants. And lastly, chemical weed control. This is not a preferable method, but if your other two methods are not working at all, maybe you have to go this route, but use it with caution. Herbicides, which can be safely used with some crops, may severely damage more sensitive ones. So you want to definitely read the label. Make sure that your crops are listed on the label before you apply anything like this. And herbicides may remain in the soil and damage future plantings. The advantage to using herbicides obviously is that it does provide effective weed control where substantial areas of single or related crops are grown. Even so, you should complement the use of herbicides with hand weeding and or mulching. And lastly, I want to talk about fertilizing after you've got your plants in the ground. So this is something that we refer to as side dressing. This is additional fertilizing during the growing season. Now, many chemical fertilizers are very soluble, so your initial application of fertilizer before you even plant or during your planting may leach beyond the root zone before your growing season ends. So many gardeners side dress with an extra application of fertilizer during the season too. A good combination of chemical fertilizer, organic fertilizer, and mulch makes a really good side dressing. Your chemical fertilizers give that initial boost required by young plants. Your organic fertilizers provide nutrients uniformly throughout the season, and mulch keeps it more evenly moist and the nutrients more uniformly available. For recommended times for side dressing vegetables, there's a really great table in the publication that I list at the end that lists several different vegetables and times during the growing season to supplement with additional fertilizer. This is my reference that I have used throughout this presentation. This is something that I refer to a lot myself as an extension agent. This is an excellent resource. It is the Home Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky publication by University of Kentucky College of Ag, Food, and Environment. I will list the link down below, and you can also get a hard copy of this as well. This is my contact information. If you have any questions about anything that I covered in this presentation, or if you have questions about anything in general regarding home gardening, please feel free to contact me, watch my other videos, subscribe to our channel, and thank you for watching.